And I know Wayne Luchek, who was part of conducting that study, is here tonight. We may put him on the spot once we get to the Q&A. Last question before we open it up to the audience. Have to put you on the spot because as a lonely Tory campaigning for universal basic income, you then became, to some extent, the architect of a pilot introduced by the Liberal Kathleen Wynne government. Talk to us about that experience and then ultimately what's happened with the cancellation and frankly, your blunt feelings about that.
So the woman who did the study, she's a health economist from the University of Manitoba Health Science Centre in Winnipeg, on what happened in Dauphin, because classically, you know, Mr. Schreier was defeated by Sterling Lyon, Mr. Trudeau was defeated by Joe Clark, new governments come in, they don't like to proceed with the plans of other governments, surprise, surprise, and the program was shut down. And nobody had ever spent a nanosecond analyzing what had happened. Did it work? Did it not work? How much was spent? What impact did it have? And this wonderful academic, Evelyn Forget, took it upon herself to take on that task. And she organized a large group of graduate students and got access to the anonymized files of the Manitoba Health Insurance thing and the federal government's files, which are all in storage somewhere in Winnipeg, and produced a detailed, peer-reviewed scientific analysis of what had actually happened. And that's where we got the results from that study to tell us how well it had worked in people's lives. And in fact, the only two groups which she found who didn't show up to work when they got the top-up were as follows. Young mothers of infant children, this is before Matley was introduced, who decided with that top-up they could stay home with their baby a little longer if they wanted to, and they did. And the other was something referred to by StatsCan as unattached young males, brackets, high school students. They could finish high school rather than leave school early to help generate some cash to keep the family afloat. And we know now that the investment return from a mother who decides to stay home with her new infant, if she's able to and wants to, is very significant in terms of that child's future. And we know that a young man in the 70s who finished high school had much more opportunity for economic advancement and getting a job than for those who had to leave at grade 8 because the family needed them to go work because they needed the cash. So Evelyn Forget was somehow, magically, became a visiting scholar at Massey College. Don't know how that happened. There must have been a meeting. I'll find out. Somebody will tell me someday. But she was a visiting scholar at Massey College, and she was known already for her work in this area. Some of it had been published in refereed journals. And the Premier's office found out she was coming, and the Premier's office called over and said, the Premier would like to see Evelyn Forget, and you can come and pour coffee. And so up we went to see the Premier of Ontario. She had a couple of her advisors in the room, and she asked Evelyn the details of what had actually happened in that part of the world, in Dauphin. And the Premier is listening to this in good faith, a remarkably bright, perceptive individual, the Premier, and she said, you know, we can do this better than we're doing it, and we have to figure out how to try. Heard nothing. That was it. End of the discussion. Friendly, handshaked, etc. Bob's your uncle. Then I get a call from a member of her staff to say, you might want to listen to the budget being brought in by the Minister of Finance. Well, I can't imagine why, but I listened. I didn't connect the two, in which he said, and we will be having a pilot project on a basic income in this province, and it will be based on trying to build connections between low-income people and opportunities in the workplace. It will be about getting better results in terms of health and education and longevity, and we'll design the pilot so we'll see if it's a better approach than what we're now doing. It was in the budget. I thought that was interesting. I didn't think it had much to do with me. And then I get a call about a week and a half later saying, would you be prepared to do a plan for the pilot, a design for what the pilot should be, how it should operate, what questions it should ask, how should the sample be drawn, what kind of community should it take place in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I got permission from the Board of Governors at Massey to take my summer and do that in that summer of 2016. And I generated that document with the help of others. We consulted broadly. I consulted with officials in the province. I went to Ottawa to consult with federal officials. I met with people who were living in poverty in different parts of the province. I met with the many advocacy groups who were working with people living in poverty to get their views and their advice and their counsel. And then we produced this document, which the province, I think I submitted it in August of 2016, and it was published by Ontario as a public document in November of 2016, and there was hardly any changes to speak of. They were pretty faithful to what I had submitted. And then when they published it, they announced that they would be launching their pilot in the spring of 2017, which of course they did right in this great city. And that's how that all happened. And the pilot was launched. Part of my mission, I met with the Social Policy Committee of the Progressive Conservative Opposition. I met with Andrea Horvath, one of your distinguished Hamiltonians and the leader of the Democrat Party and members of her staff, to make sure that I got their views about the pilot. And I met with the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party to make sure I got his views. And they were all in some way reflected in the nuance in the document, because we did not want this to be a partisan document. We wanted to be a document to go out and ask some questions and do it in an organized way, so we would then know by having two groups, those who are in the plan and those who aren't, and measuring their progress on healthcare and housing and educational and food security and other issues, to see whether one group did better, and then to figure out the reality of costs. Because if Group A, who was getting the top up, used the healthcare system less, that would produce some impact on the other side of the ledger. And you can't really cost one of these programs properly if you just look at the expenditure side without looking at what other costs might be obviated, because you're reducing the pathologies of poverty. And the program was launched, and during the election campaign, the issue only came up when a reporter asked all three leaders, by then the leader of the party, the opposition was Mr. Ford, how they felt about the project continuing, because it had been launched before. And of course the Liberals would want to see it continued. The NDP, while not without some cynicism about the Liberals, because that's what opposition parties do, said they would like to see the project finished and they'd like to see the results before they came to a decision. And I think the young woman's name was Laston on the Premier's bus when asked the question twice in 2 days. Said, no, we like the project, we'd like to see it go forward and get the results before we make a decision. So everybody had the sense that this would not be a divided partisan proposition. And then a month or so after they form a government, they shut it down. So I've learned in politics never to question people's motivation. I can question their judgment. I can question their sense of balance. I can question how much they understand the implications of what they're doing. And I think the government did this simply because it was somebody else's idea. Because it came from a previous government, and they were trying, and you know, every new government comes in, you go through the same opera, right? Oh, the cupboard is bare. Surprise. Oh, we're going to have to cut. Oh, the deficit is $600 billion, except it isn't, and it never was. But there you have it. It's part of the ritual. And in that context, of course, when they get a little panic-stricken because all the taxes that have been cut and what they had to spend to deal with hydro and then the buck of beer and all this other really substantial, important parts of civilization, they were a little short of cash in their first quarter. So they went around the cabinet table and said to every minister, what can you put into the pot from your department so we can manage in this short period of time? And I think it was easy as pie. for the civil servants to say to the minister in Community and Children's Services, this is costing us $50 million a year, which, by the way, is 0.5% of the billion that it costs every year to run a welfare system that doesn't work properly. We can just can this thing and put our $50 million into the pot, and that'll be our contribution. And that's how it died. If I thought it had died because there was a thoughtful analysis and there was a different view, that's one thing. I don't think any of that happened, which makes it even more painful at some level. But it's also unforgivable. And when I made the statement in the Spectator this morning about the progressive conservatives, which was my tradition, versus the small-minded conservatives, I meant every syllable of it.
Thank you. So can I just ask, who's got the mics? Excellent. Tom, thank you both. Knowing that this is a crowd of Hamiltonians not known for being shrinking violets, who wants to put a question to Hugh Segal and get the discussion started? Bill.
Yes, here, Bill. My question to Mr. Hugh Segal is, as you described what happened with basic income, the three parties agree. But was it a document or was it a bill that they agree, but after the new leader was elected, he broke that promise? Is it something that we should ask in the future for the leaders of the parties, whatever they are, 3, 4, the same in Ottawa? If they agree with something, please to put that as a bill. Because when there is a change in the government, we know there will be change on that. That next government is not going to keep that promise that they made. And the other thing is to address poverty, basic income, homeless. I don't think we have a ministry in Ontario or in Ottawa to address those issues.
Fair question. Thank you, Bill.
You know, we have our brothers and sisters who are not seniors, veterans. They have a ministry, my understanding. They have a ministry, but poverty, homeless, basic income, we don't have anybody to, as a ministry, when something happens, at least when there is a change in government, we can go back to those individuals.
Great.
Thanks
Thank you
very much.
Thank you. Let me answer the second part of the question first. I think your Minister of Labor, Minister Tassi, is it here, is responsible for the whole issue around the minimum wage, which brings her in some close proximity to the question of poverty and people being treated properly and a living wage. The federal government, under its Employment and Social Development Ministry, is the place that developed the child benefit, which helps poor families across the country and with kids, and it's a very constructive approach. In Ontario, it was always the Community and Social Services Ministry that dealt with matters relating to poverty. I think, though, the challenge is that however good the public servants may be and how hard they are and whatever their long-term plans are, when a new government gets elected and they decide to change those plans, there's very little that you can do about it. I would say that, the last years of the Wynne administration, there was quite a bit of partisan division in the legislature between the various parties. The sense of working together on stuff wasn't very strong. Let me compare that to a little legislature in the east of Canada called Prince Edward Island. where the Liberal Premier brought in a resolution in favor of a basic income pilot, and all the parties supported it. And then when he was defeated, which he was, and a progressive conservative government, Premier Dennis King, a red Tory, got elected, he said, well, we made a commitment as a legislature, we have to keep that promise. And they established a committee of the legislature, an all-party committee, which is working as we sit here tonight on how to do what we tried to do in Ontario effectively in Prince Edward Island for their jurisdiction. So I'm an optimist about finding ways to do it, but the point you make is very well taken.
Okay. Jennifer, over here.
Thank you, Hugh. Thanks. My name is Lance Dingman. I was a recipient of the basic income. And Hugh, my question is, what do we do now for basic income? What do we do? What do I do as I've been on FBA, ODSP my whole adult life. I've pushed for change. I want change. We need change. Hugh, what do we do now?
Great question.
Well, the one thing we cannot do ever on this file, either as individuals who are living through the experience directly, as you have, or as people who are supportive of that, is we must never give up. We have to hang in. The Premier of this province, for better or for worse, is about as low down in the opinion polls as you can be after 2 years in government. 22 points in the polls. And when they begin to think about how they're going to get reelected, because every party in power thinks about that, they're going to ask themselves where they have to go. And I actually think that the study which came out from McMaster this morning and other work that may be done in Thunder Bay and other places will be a basis for that discussion to be kicked open. Because there are members of the Conservative caucus and the Liberal caucus and the NDP who would like to see the basic income brought forward. And they're going to be pushing for that. And I think it's important that we ensure that it be part of the campaign platforms of hopefully at least 2 of the 3 parties, if not all of them. So we have to keep on working. We have to keep on taking the information. And the great thing about this morning's report, it doesn't allow the government to sweep it under the rug. It's now public domain for everybody to see, and that's the beginning of wisdom, and we have to keep on working.
Indeed. Going to go back to the top, Dave?
My name is Dave Cherkuski, and along with Rhonda and Jody and Lance, we are living proof. And I thank you for mentioning Buckabeer, because I think most of us were there. The bus that the roundtable got wasn't wheelchair accessible, and so I went with Michael, who there was a celebration of life for him last week. So I was there for the Buckabeer Circus, and when I saw it, I said, God help us all. If this is our government here in Ontario, God help us all the next 4 years. And that was 2 years, a year and a half ago. You talked to the leader of the opposition at the time, who wasn't our premier. You commented on that, or I'd like to know your opinion of our premier. Where we go from now, can you comment on, and actually for me, when the cancellation came, I said, wait a minute, the announcement wasn't that they're canceling the basic income. That was the footnote. There was another document that, through Ted and his predecessor, or his follower, is the Ontario income reform that Laura can talk about. And there was a report there where they were going to create a new income support system for Ontario. What the announcement was is that they're killing that. Because I think the government was ready to make a 10-year commitment to say we can create a poverty-free Ontario. They created the plan. All right, the change of government who said, we don't like your plan. So can you comment on what the current Ford regressive conservative government and its ministers of misery have done? Because I'll tell you what, I'm still waiting for Minister McLeod to get back to me. Because that day, One of the MPPs talked about me, and I turned to her staff and said, they're talking about me. The minister said she wants to talk to me. You have my information, call me. My phone didn't ring. My email didn't, I didn't meet the minister who's since moved on. And I like you're saying at the cabinet table, it's $50 million, not billions in universalizing it. It was a research project. Because when they talked about it, and they said, yeah, it's a research project. And we're interested in the research, but you can't cancel the research and get the research. So can you speak on that? And also, there is a class action lawsuit that may come. How that might affect policy.
Thank you.
Well, I'll deal with the last part first, and then I'll deal with the first part. I know that the class action lawsuit by the participants in the program in Lindsay and elsewhere has been launched. Some of the early court divisions have been constructive, some have not been. So that's an ongoing process, and I think it's important because it's important, as class action lawsuits do, to attach an actual monetary value to the damage that was done to individuals and their lives. People joined up in good faith, and they made decisions about their lives. They went for extra education. They moved to a slightly better place. They did things that made a big difference, and then it was slashed away from them, and that had a huge negative damage effect on their life, and somebody should pay for that. And in my judgment, that's why hoping that the class action lawsuit makes progress and is pursued, I think is very worthwhile. My judgment of what the government has done on poverty, the present government of Ontario, is avoid the issue every way they can. And when they announce, think about this for a moment, they won't have a pilot, which we supported, in support of finding a better way to distribute income to low-income people responsibly, the basic income pilot, but they will have a pilot with private companies going to figure out how to kick people off welfare. Right? They are prepared to. So that tells you where their head is at. And I think they are concluding, quite frankly, that poor people don't vote. Poor people are too tied up managing the various serious challenges in their life because they don't have the resources they need, and therefore they don't think they matter. And I think it's important for all of us who care to make it clear that they do matter, and that the government should pay a very large price for what they did in the cancellation of that pilot.
Yes, hello. This afternoon you spoke briefly on transfer payments from the federal government, that this could be financed that way. Could you expand on that a bit?
A little closer with the mic.
This afternoon you touched on transfer payments from the federal government for paying these programs. Could you expand on that a bit?
Sure. So we have things in Canada that we understand to be part of the operating financial system, equalization. So equalization basically says that all federal taxpayers pay money into the federal government. The federal government then distributes money to the provinces based on the per capita income that those provinces get from their own local taxes. And if the wealthier provinces get more, because they're wealthier and their economy is stronger, the federal government makes a transfer payment to the provinces to equalize them up to about 85% of what the wealthier provinces get from their taxpayers. This is not a check that goes from Alberta to Quebec, as some would have you believe. It's a transfer that goes directly from Ottawa to the provinces by formula. And that formula and the other transfer payments that go for health and education and welfare are negotiated through something called the Federal Provincial Fiscal Relations Act. And that law is only passed after the provinces and Ottawa have negotiated what the rates and terms should be for those transfers, which they do roughly every 5 years. So that is a tremendous, in my view, opportunity, and that'll be coming up in about 3 years' time. That is a tremendous opportunity to say, look, if we move to supporting from Ottawa basic incomes in different parts of Canada, which would be different province by province because each province is different economically and otherwise, that would affect those transfer payments in a way that would be mutually beneficial for both sides. So I see that as an opportunity to get this back on the agenda of meaningful federal provincial discussions, because the nature of the Canadian Constitution says that welfare per se is largely a provincial jurisdiction, although the federal government does engage at the level of seniors and children and a whole bunch of other constructive things. We have to find a way to have that discussion take place so it's not an obstacle to making real progress on this file, but it's a way of actually moving ahead to get the money to people who need it in a way that is respectful of their individual rights to make choices as citizens like everybody else.
My name's Tiffany Cece, and I'm not a local Hamiltonian. I'm from Toronto, but it certainly was worth driving the 2.5 hours in traffic to make it here. I'm a high school teacher out in York Region, so I completely agree with your sentiments about the small-minded Conservatives. I'm also a member of OBIN, so the Ontario Basic Income Network. And my esteemed colleague, John Mills, has been working tirelessly with the Hamilton School Board to try and engage youth. And so I guess my question to you is twofold. One, is there, or in your experience or what you're seeing right now currently, do you think that there is a means or a way that we can mobilize youth to sort of latch on to this concept? And if not, is there another demographic that you think would be a great force that we could use and harness for, like you said, encouraging parties to support this platform?
Thank you. Well, one of the opportunities, both for your students and other students in high schools across Ontario, to get engaged will be right here in Hamilton, Ontario on the 22nd of May, when the North American Basic Income Congress is taking place. And there's already some 70 proposals for workshops, and I know, having talked to the organizers earlier today, they're very keen on having young people, both college students and high school students, so that they understand the issue and they begin to get involved with the movement to achieve a measure of economic balance and justice as a foundation for how our society should go forward. So that would be my first answer. My second answer is as follows. You know, every constituency has a constituency office for the local MPP. And people will show up at that office to get help on local provincial matters where the MPP can be assistance. And then people will show up because they're upset about the government's approach on, for example, education and various issues. I think it'll be really, really interesting to consider what I think the unions have developed. It's a very thoughtful idea called the information picket. It's not a picket to get in the way of anybody going to work. It's not a picket that slows anybody else's progress, but it's there for the purpose of sharing information that really matters. And what really matters to that MPP, whether he or she is of any political affiliation, is what's going on in his or her own constituency around folks who are living in poverty. And that doesn't get discussed at the Rotary meetings all the time. Sometimes it does. Rotary tries to help, but it doesn't get discussed. But young people would be a tremendous instrument to deliver that information, to develop it themselves, to discuss it amongst themselves, and to come to their own conclusions about it, because their conclusions may be better than older people's conclusions, and then to share that directly with their local MPP in the local constituency office, asking for appointments, asking to go in and have that discussion. And if that happened in half the offices of the MPPs of our province, you'd see a huge change in the discussion and debate around this issue.
We have time for 2 or 3 more, and I'm going to go to Jennifer, and Jennifer, you can find a willing suspect.
Willing suspect. Couple of things. First of all, what struck me in what you just said earlier tonight when you're talking is how willing the current MPs in government were to get rid of the basic income. And it seems to me that all it did, and this is maybe something you can take back to them, all it did was create public cynicism outside of basic income because they didn't give a toss about their promises. Now, what does that say about politicians generally? What does it say about parties? And what does it say to people who have given up? I mean, why should people pay any attention at all when that sort of thing takes place? Secondly, I appreciate what you were saying about one government, a new government, not wanting to follow in the footsteps of the old. But at the same time, it always seems to be conservatives when they get in that they're the ones that want to do the destroying. They are always the ones that want to light the fire and get rid of anything progressive. And I'm sorry, the government we have in Ontario right now is a regressive conservative government.
So, Hugh, at the
Yeah.
risk, at
No, 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 it's a
at the
good
risk of
question.
being partisan, you have thoughts on how historically conservatism in Canada has really been different from that in the US or the UK or other places, shaped by a greater sense of collective responsibility. And it's clear that there are tensions and movements that make the party today look very different than the one that you joined after John Diefenbaker came to your elementary school. Can you just reflect on that?
Yeah, and let me deal with the direct question put by the gentleman, which I think was very straightforward. Look, when a new government sweeps into office, right, with a new premier who had never had a day of experience in provincial politics, not a day, right? Never worked in a department, was never an MPP. He was a town councillor here in Toronto for a while, and that was it. And everybody takes the view, well, this is the premier who brought us into office. Well, the truth of the matter is, the Conservative Party, and I don't want to be unkind to our Liberal friends here this evening, but the Conservative Party was so far ahead in the polls that Pinocchio could have been their leader and they would have swept into office. Well, and Pinocchio may have been a better option, who knows? But when that happens, you get this kind of leadership cult thing where people say, well, we're not going to differ with the new boss in the first 3 weeks that we've just arrived, because we'd like to be considered for a cabinet post in 5 years' time or 4 years' time. So all those kind of groupthink constrictions get in the way of what you and I would consider rational discussion and thoughtful debate. So there wasn't the pushback that there should have been on that. And there wasn't the pushback on some other things they did, quite frankly, which there should have been from a moderate progressive conservative caucus. And clearly this government does not view itself as a moderate progressive conservative caucus. It sees itself as fixing all the sins that were committed previously, as if their government never committed any sins, and doing it as radically and strictly and insensitively as they can. That's why they're at 22% in the polls. That's why they're falling further and further down every day. So the people of Ontario get it. People of Ontario understand exactly what's going on. They understand what's going on in the education part. They get it. And the issue will be, and here's the challenge, will what's left of the more thoughtful conservatives have enough clout before the next election to get them to change course? I don't know the answer to that. I'm pessimistic as we sit here, deeply pessimistic. Now, I remember people like Bill Davis, who brought in the OSAP program for students. I remember conservative leaders like Richard Hatfield, who brought in official bilingualism in the province of New Brunswick. I remember leaders like Brian Mulrooney, who increased the old age pension. I remember all those things, and that doesn't mitigate what bad conservatives do when they're narrow-minded. But it does say that we have had in our history, on occasion, examples of a more humane progressive conservatism. Sadly, I would say those of us who were in that camp as red Tories or whatever, and our host was good enough to make that reference, have very little to protect us but the game laws. Because the other brand of conservatism, of which you made reference, is sadly in the ascendancy. But the good news is, the voters don't seem to be very impressed with that option. They weren't impressed in the last federal election in 2019. They say, we're not interested in whatever it is they're not selling, or what they're not telling us about, and they let the Liberals win another in serious trouble.
We're going to go to Tom and then back to Jennifer, and then we'll do a wrap-up. Yes, sir.
My name's Carl Crevar. In my community here, by the way, I want to thank you for your presentation. We've been fighting for the basic income as an answer to poverty. People that we deal with or advocate on behalf of, which haven't been mentioned too much this evening, are people with disabilities. I attended a conference in December in Ottawa. It's the fourth one, and they're still trying to figure out how to convince any government that's in power to address the poverty of people with particularly with disabilities. We come up with solutions, but it falls on deaf ears. We have continuous conferences going on, coming up with solutions that fall on deaf ears. So, you know, when you talk about governments, I remind when I talk to the MPPs, or even people in our city council here, that elections come around, that they work for the people of this province and this city. The people do not work for them. And, you know, we have some problems in this community, and I was very disappointed to hear just yesterday or whenever the vote was taken in our own community, that poverty seems to be, or the minimum wage and poverty seems to be a dirty word. And, you know, we have to recognize here in this city that we have a high level of poverty, and for our city fathers to turn around and say, for the workers in this city here, that to raise the minimum wage to, it's even below what it takes to live in this city, is a dirty thing.
I'm going to ask you to get to a question if I could, sir.
My question would be to you. I know I've been at it for over 30 years, dealing with people with disabilities as well as those that are injured in the work. You've made some statements, you've made some comments, some very positive statements that we have to continue to try and talk to our MPPs, which we have been doing. One of the solutions that, I don't know what you think about this, that I tell each government that comes in, and I'm trying to find a solution to talk to them and say, how do we stop that train that comes in every 4 years, where you have a program that is working for one political party, then when the next one comes in, they make those changes. The third one comes in and makes another change, which affects people that are living in poverty.
Right. Thank you.
I would say to the last part of the question is we should try to build these programs in a much more multi-partisan way, so all the parties are involved and all the parties sign off, so there's no excuse when one of them wins another election or loses to another party for them to make a radical change. And what tends to happen sometimes is that governments bring in a program, they believe in it, the opposition opposes it because they don't have any stake in it. It becomes a divisive issue, and then, of course, if the election goes the wrong way, we face the risk which you described so eloquently. And I think we have to try to find a way. There are some hopeful things. There is the parliamentary caucus on poverty in Ottawa, all parties, Bloc Québécois, Conservatives, Liberals, New Democrats, and they meet on a regular basis to discuss the issue. So the real challenge is to say that at all party committee, what are you doing about it? You're having meetings, you're learning, and that's good. What are you doing to get an all party commitment on this issue? And by the way, in a minority government, where the government needs the support of other parties to get votes through, this is the best time for an all party approach to have real salience and real impact. So I'm optimistic about that. In the pilot project, I met with members of the disabled community to get their advice. And one of the most salient discussions I had was a woman who was she was a quadriplegic, in a wheelchair. She was an economist, very bright. With the various technologies available, she could work on a computer and she could do work. But the terms and regulations for the ODSP program created a huge risk for her if she worked. She could lose the basic grant, which was $1,200, and in my case, I'd recommend it go up go up by another $500 to $1,700 to give them a bit more flexibility. And she said rationally to me, look, I know it's going to be more expensive to manage this disability as I get older. I can work, I can consult, I can generate savings, I can do what responsible people do, which is put money away for that rainier day than the day that's already pretty rainy to begin with. But the program says I can't do it without taking the risk of losing the basic grant, which is why our pilot project called for not only raising the amount from $1,200 a month to $1,700 a month, but not to disqualify work, to encourage them to work and to keep some of that money and save some of that money and not have it all taxed back dollar for dollar, which is the way the old system and the present system operates. So that's what the pilot was trying to do. It got canceled, sadly, but I think that that idea still is a fundamental one for treating people with respect in their own lives. Yeah.
And our last question is right here.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. How would you propose setting the levels for guaranteed basic income in the context that we have here in Ontario, where in some cities you have skyrocketing rents? And I think, for example, next door to me, the apartment that was renting for $800 2 years ago is now renting for $1,650.
Right.
And that's happening all over the city. There's a very organized process of rent evictions and,
Yes.
you know, and and neither the provincial government nor the federal government nor the municipal government seem to have the wherewithal to deal with it. So, you know, if somebody is already in rent, in an apartment rent geared to income, you bring in a UBI, then their disposable income will double. But somebody who is looking for an apartment with the same UBI will have maybe $200 a month left over afterwards.
So look, I think if we're going to be serious about a basic income for all Canadians who fall beneath a certain level, who are topped up, then that has to be dealt with every other, like any other income that is addressed by federal government or provincial government statute. It has to be adjusted on a regular basis to the real costs of living. It has to reflect those costs. It has to, it's not about making people totally comfortable to live forever without having to do any work, quite the contrary. It should be an incentive to work, but it should make sure they always have enough for the basics. And the bottom line is that if the basics go up, cost of rent, for example, as you referenced, or the cost of food goes up, then there has to be adjustments to that basic income. And there should be a mechanism to do that, just as there's a mechanism to adjust salaries of civil servants. And just as there's a mechanism to adjust salaries for people who work in the private sector. And that should be part, after you do the pilot and get the evidence and the data, of the statutory base. The law that establishes that should lay out those principles for adjustment on a pretty regular basis, or else it won't do the job it's supposed to do, and your question is spot on.
Excellent. Thank you. Can I just ask, is Lisa Alfano here from the Basic Income Group? Lisa, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to plug the conference that Hugh already shamelessly plugged, but tell us about what's coming to Hamilton.
There is going to be a basic income conference. It's the North American gathering of advocates for basic income, and it's going to be in May. I was actually going to speak more about Basic Income Hamilton. Someone might remember the date. Is the date May 24th? 21st to 24th. Thank you very much. You're all welcome to come to that event, and we hope to see new faces both at that event and also in Basic Income Hamilton. So I just wanted to thank you all for coming tonight and demonstrating your interest in the basic income concept. Of course, thank you to Hugh Segal for sharing his invaluable experience with all of us, and to the Hamilton Community Foundation and to the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction for giving us this opportunity to co-present this important event. A little bit about Basic Income Hamilton. Our mission is to raise awareness, educate, and engage Hamiltonians on the concept of basic income. And we do that through organizing different types of events and holding monthly meetings. And some of the events that we've done in the past, we've done some film screenings. For instance, we screened the Manitoba story, which is all about the basic income pilot that happened in Dauphin, Manitoba, which Mr. Segal did already talk about. And if you ever get the chance to see that film, you really should watch it. And we've also organized some other events around artists for basic income and also giving the opportunity for people with lived experience to speak about their experience on the BI pilot and their experience with poverty. I did want to also just mention that we are looking for more people to join our group. And if you're interested in learning more about basic income, we welcome you to join us, because we are quite an active group in the city, but not just in the city, but also in the province. And we'd like to see even more engagement, especially because of the Congress that is coming. So some ways that you could get involved, you could visit our website. It could be just as small as visiting our website and signing up for our mailing list. Our website is basicincomehamilton.ca. You can also follow or like us on social media. Our hashtag is, our handle is basicincomeHam. And we might have some business cards. Carmen, one of our members, might have some cards that she can put out at the exit when you leave here tonight. And as I mentioned, we'd love to see you at a meeting. We meet every first Wednesday of the month at City Hall in room 264, and we meet from 4:30 to 6. Our next meeting is on April 1st, and all are welcome. So we hope to see some people who are engaged in this topic and engaged in this fight, I guess we can call it, to move this idea ahead. So thank you again for your interest, and hope to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Immediately following our adjournment, Hugh is going to be signing copies of his book in the lobby. If you're interested, I would highly recommend it. It's a great, accessible read and a powerful statement in favor of what we talk about in basic income and of much of your life story. I'm going to call on artist Jesse Gollum now to make a small presentation of gratitude for your presence here today and your sharing of your wisdom.
Hi, Hugh. Thank you so much for coming here, and on behalf of all of the basic income advocates and all the basic income recipients, many of are which in this room, just thank you for your work and for your advocacy. And you are really, what you did is help build a better Ontario and a better future and a better society. So thank you so much, Hugh.
Well done. Thank you. How did you escape? I'm reminded as we leave, having heard your inspiring words today, that at the end of your book, you talk about, we will remember not the voices of our critics, but the silence of our friends. And you have many friends in this community. We are deeply committed to the cause, but most importantly, we are gratified and thankful for a lifetime of service that you've rendered to Canada, but specifically to the importance of dignity for all of our citizens. Thank you so much for being with us. God bless. We're adjourned. Safe home.